tone and language in the historical novel. It has not been sufficiently emphasized that although we possess an enormous mass of written documents and also visual documents from the past, nothing is left to us of voices before the first nasal-sounding phonograph records of the 19th century. What is more, as far as the representation of speech is concerned, nothing or virtually nothing was achieved before certain great novelists or dramatists of the 19th century. By that I mean that they were the first to register conversation in all its spontaneity. It's disjointed logic, its complex byways, its lacunae, and its unarticulated implications without passing through tragic or comic stylization or lyric outburst. Neither antiquity nor any of the intervening centuries offers us the equivalent of a conversation between Pierre Bezukhov and Prince Andrei in Tolstoy, between Ibsen's Rosmer and Rebecca West and her wily brother-in-law, or at opposite ends of the spectrum, Vautrin's words as he propounds his views on life to Lucien, or the brief interchange between Marcel and the doctor who comes to listen to his grandmother's heartbeat. The transcription of speech in terms of pure realism without any sort of bias is curiously contemporaneous with those two mechanical means of reproducing the object as it is, the phonograph and the photograph. Mutatis mutandis, the same observations can be made about the unspoken words which take shape within us under the sudden impact of an experience. Rastignac's impressions as he looks out over Paris from the heights of Père Lachaise, the last thoughts that cross Anna Karenina's mind, the feelings of Prince Andrei as he lies wounded on the battlefield of Austerlitz. It follows that for every novelistic attempt at recreation, the representation of these various unstylized forms of speech constitutes an enormous stumbling block. One may indeed wonder if the methods used to achieve this in the novel as it developed in Europe in the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century aren't really meaningless when applied to an earlier period. One may especially wonder if the fact that the ancients themselves have left nothing of this sort doesn't prove that the form of the novel is badly adapted to evoking ancient sensibility. Let us look again at those literary texts out of which emerge, so to speak, the sounds and spoken rhythms of that period, which extends roughly from Pericles to Julian the Apostate, a period of about 8 centuries. The philosophical dialogue was a Greek genre par excellence, subsequently a Latin one by imitation. In it, literary conventions are naturally combined with dialectic conventions. It is only here and there in brief passages, mostly in prologues or epilogues, meant to give the reader a rest, that Plato, with an admirable artistry, and I underscore the word artistry, slips in some short exchanges which might be those of contemporary conversation. The great tragedians, by definition, use a tragic style, itself often derived from the archaic terms and turns of phrase of epic language. The dialogues of comedy are often confined either to the language of humble people — one could write an entire essay on the amused condescension of comic authors in every era who reproduce, each in his own way, popular speech — or, more rarely, to the parody of polished language, such as the public believes is spoken. The utterances of Socrates in the Clouds are like the arguments of Bergson or Gabriel Marcel translated into popular jokes. Menander and Terence give their characters a language of bourgeois correctness, somewhat colorless, which was later imitated everywhere by the high comedy of the 17th and 18th centuries, a language which has never been spoken outside of the theater. The mimes offer us observations of an exquisite realistic precision, but once again based on ironic condescension. Herondas and Theocritus look down on their panders and gossips from a great height. The picaresque novel, of which we have only 2 examples, Petronius and Apuleius, sometimes has the limitations of mime, sometimes those of a good joke or popular tale. Certain elegiac or lyric poems tell us something about the tone of voice in which emotions were spoken, cried out, or sung. We feel that that cry of passion in Theocritus's Sorceress must have been uttered more or less in that way, without doubt. Even overly literary works like Ovid's Art of Love supply us with something of the tone of flirtatious conversations. all the more so as that sort of conversation is based on conventions. Here and there, the Greek epigrammatists open clear vistas. 6 verses of Callimachus sum up what an intellectual faced with suicide must have thought and therefore said. The foreign slave asking to be buried according to his native rites in an epigram of Dioscorides must have spoken almost like that. Yet once again we find that decantation, which is the characteristic in itself admirable of ancient literature. The poet serves as a sort of filter. Satirists exaggerate by profession. Some of Martial's epigrams give us the tone of Roman gossip. The broadside of insults directed against Caesar by Catullus must have been mouthed by many of Pompey's partisans, yet these versified obscenities are still literature. The historians also simplify and schematize, distancing themselves, if not from the deeds, and who has better described deeds than Thucydides, at least from the hubbub of words surrounding those deeds. We know that they undertook to rewrite the debates they inserted into their work in order to make them express what the orator might have or ought to have said. Even less do we hear the tumult of an assembly in their works, yet stenographic transcripts existed. But it would have been contrary to their concept of history to have reproduced them as they were. Their purpose is, in effect, exemplary, as it is with Plutarch, or, in another sense, an a contrario, with Tacitus, or else analytic, as it is with Thucydides and Polybius. It is rarely, if ever, the reality of an incident seized at the moment, and even less the reality of verbal exchange and voice. Suetonius gives us the written equivalent of those realistic Roman portrait busts of private citizens and statesmen. But from that series of traits of character or of manners scarcely a spoken word emerges, and never so much as a fragment of conversation. To be sure, from time to time, a historic utterance, whether authentic or not, and I would maintain that at this distance authenticity is of little importance, causes us to hear a voice almost always raised to the diapason of a cry, or else some decisive words which sum up a situation and are engraved, as it were, for the posterity of all time. Tu coq, brute, qualis artifex pereo, alea iacta est. We hear them, so to speak, in a void, isolated from whatever words or cries preceded or followed them. The angry interjections of the conspirators as they fall on Julius Caesar, the terrified murmur of the poor women and faithful slaves around Nero, the excited conversations of the officers and men as they crossed the Rubicon with their leader, and the exceedingly mediocre life of Commodus in the Historia Augusta, the decree condemning Commodus to the Scale Gemone, stuns us because it makes us feel palpably the enormous surge of hatred that swept over the senators as they looked on the dead emperor. It is one of the rare cases where the rumbling of a mob can be heard across centuries. Happily, there are sub-literary documents, that which I've just cited as one of them, which haven't undergone the filtering or rearranging literature entails. Legal judgments or decrees, such as the senatorial warrants or decisions punishing with death participation in the Bacchanalia, which cause us brutally to experience the terror of the people inculpated. Letters of private citizens which furnish us with the tone of a student apologizing for having wrecked the family chariot, or of a soldier asking his family to send him a care package, the letters of Cicero and Pliny, more consciously belonging to the epistolary genre, which tell us something about written communications in upper-class society. Graffiti, which contain the scrawled echo of the talk and shouts of the street. They are voices out of the past, some of them practically in their raw state, each of them giving us the faint shock of the unexpected. Yet there is nothing in them that would have enabled me to recreate with even a minimum of plausibility an exchange about serious or urgent, subtle or complex matters, a conversation between Hadrian and Trajan, or Plotina or Antinous, or with his legate Severus concerning the affairs of Judea. Nothing, or virtually nothing, is left us of those inflections, those quarter tones, those articulated half smiles which yet can change everything. I I shall inflict only one example upon the reader. I caused Hadrian to report in scarcely amplified form an incident which is recounted in a few words in a chronicle. The emperor, ill, had asked a doctor for some poison, and the doctor killed himself in order not to have to refuse the request. At the outset, the novelist adds to this skeletal news item a few details she hopes are plausible. The emperor's sympathy for the young doctor. I took pleasure in his intelligence, both daring and dreamy, and in the dark fire of those deep-set eyes. Subterfuges used to persuade the chief doctor, Hermogenes, from whom the emperor could not hope for this ultimate help, to go spend the day in Rome, thus leaving the sick man in the care of his young assistant. Quote, an excuse came for me to get rid of Hermogenes for several hours. He had to examine candidates for the chair of medicine, which I had just founded at the Odeon, end of quote. The interview, which on Hadrian's part ends in supplications, quote, I insisted, I made absolute demand, I employed every means to try to arouse his pity or to corrupt him. He will be the last man whom I shall have implored, end of quote. The equivocal response of the doctor, quote, finally won over, he promised me to go and seek the dose of poison. I awaited him in vain until evening. Late in the night, I learned with horror that he had just been found dead in his laboratory with a glass phial in his hands, end of quote. I believe the tone of this passage to be more or less correct. But suppose I had tried to present these actions and conversations directly. I know that I would have fallen into error, into melodrama or pastiche or both. In this regard, popular literature alternates between the servile copying of a few ancient expressions known to everyone, quote, full, I am full, end of quote, says the drunken patrician in the old French operetta, quote, bear these winged words to Metella, end of quote, and the homespun ingenuity of technicolor scenarios, quote, Spartacus, I think I'm going to have a baby, end of quote. Someone will say that Corneille and Cinna, Racine and Britannicus, and Shakespeare and Julius Caesar managed it all rather well, but that is, of course, because they possessed genius. It is also, and perhaps even more to the point, because they were not concerned with tonal authenticity. Without having compiled the preceding catalog, I chose to make Hadrian use a dignified form of speech. Without having compiled the preceding catalog, I chose to make Hadrian use a dignified form of speech, oratio togata, different though they are from each other, and whether they are called commentaries, meditations, epistles, treatises, or discourses, the greatest works of the Greek and Latin prose writers who come before or immediately after Hadrian all belong more or less within this category of sustained style, half narrative, half meditative, but always essentially written, from which immediate impressions and sensations are virtually excluded and from which any verbal exchange is ipso facto banished. Obviously, it was not a question here of imitating Caesar, Seneca, or even Marcus Aurelius, but of deriving from them a pattern, a rhythm, the equivalent of a piece of fabric, which one subsequently drapes as one will over the nude model. The style of the toga would provide the emperor with that dignity without which we cannot imagine antiquity. Wrongly, no doubt, yet also with some reason, for dignity was one of man's ideals down to the end of antiquity. As he lay dying, Caesar arranged the folds of his toga. This style allowed me to eliminate those minima which are proverbially eschewed by the praetor. The sounds of spoken exchanges fell away by themselves. There was no more question of Hadrian's recounting his conversation with Osrhoes than of Caesar's having thought to put in writing his discussion with Vercingetorix. Even better, the Oratio Togata allowed me to present Hadrian addressing, beyond his contemporaries and his adopted grandson, an ideal interlocutor, man himself, who has been the enticing chimera for all civilizations down to our time. He thereby addresses us, Unbelievable. Even better, the Oratio Togata allowed me to present Hadrian addressing, beyond his contemporaries and his adopted grandson, an ideal interlocutor, man himself, who has been the enticing chimera for all civilizations down to our time. He thereby addresses us. But to speak of an address is also to speak of monologue, and it was at that level that I finally found the voice. Possibly that observation has more significance for Hadrian than for us, since in that epoch a man reading alone, and no doubt writing alone, read or wrote aloud. In attempting to rediscover that voice through the deliberate form of an address, I used the little, but the diverse little, that is left from Hadrian himself. We possess no more than 3 lines of the memoirs he dictated to or had composed by an amanuensis, which no doubt constituted only a very official resume of his life. Nevertheless, the man who admits therein to having got drunk as a youth at Trajan's table in order to curry favor with him was surely not a man who shrouded everything in lies. The strategist who, in an address to his troops, described with a refined precision their movements on a day of maneuvers, reveals the intellectual beneath the general-in-chief. I tried to synthesize a series of strict legal or administrative decrees emanating from the head of state with the casual, light verses of the great amateur who, although he preferred the most difficult poets, seems himself willingly to have turned to the popular poetry of his day when he wrote his own verse. I had to make the best use I could of 3 intimate letters, which are perhaps authentic and which, even if they aren't, at least show how at that time people thought Hadrian expressed himself. One, gay and playful to his mother-in-law. Another, detached to a brother-in-law who was also his secret enemy. The third, very dignified to his successor. A few writings by contemporaries who were part of his circle also seem at moments to refract his voice. Arrian, if it is indeed he, addressing Hadrian in his Periplus of the Black Sea, gives an example of the tender allusions his familiars made to the emperor on the subject of the dead and deified Antinous. The folklore gathered more or less from everywhere by Phlegon, his secretary, shows us the topics, if not the tone, of the casual conversations at table and at the end of a day's journey. The list of administrative divisions of Antinopolis, charged with religious and mystical significance, carries us back to the orders given in his own voice by Hadrian for the founding of that city.